China's propaganda and influence operations are in the spotlight after officials in two different countries found themselves at the center of Beijing's public attacks in recent months. Our first stop is the Philippines. A Philippine Coast Guard spokesperson has found himself at the center of Beijing's latest messaging campaign. The Chinese embassy in Manila has repeatedly criticized him after he challenged Beijing's actions in the South China Sea. And he's not alone. Other Filipino officials and even journalists have been singled out. Chinese state media and pro-Beijing voices online quickly amplified the accusations, pushing the narrative across television and social media. So is this just diplomatic sparring or part of a messaging campaign we're seeing across the region? And what can journalists and media organizations do to respond? Joining us from Manila is Philippine journalist Regine Cabato. And also with us in the studio is Summer Chen, founder of FactLink, a Taiwan-based initiative on digital investigation and media and AI literacy. Thank you both for joining us. Regine, let me start with you. How did you and your organization, the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism, end up getting dragged into these online attacks from Chinese embassy in Manila?
The Chinese embassy has been in a bit of a word war for a few months now with the Coast Guard spokesman for issues on West Philippine Sea, Jay Tariela. They have constantly been on his case. And because Jay Tariela in late February had shared a story of ours that was basically analyzing pro-China narratives, the embassy threw that into their mix of statements against Tariela and in effect also included the PCIJ. They used that statement as an opportunity to kind of point out that the PCIJ is receiving or has received funding supposedly from National Endowment for Democracy by the embassy's claim that effectively means that the PCIJ is a tool of US propaganda. That was their insinuation. The PCIJ historically has been an independent media outlet, a small watchdog newsroom that has played a huge role in corruption busting in Philippine history and in explanatory and investigative journalism. And we get a bunch of funding from different places, including the UN. And none of these funders dictate what we publish. PCIJ has been quite supportive. I'm actually just a freelancer with them. I'm just a contributor. And so in our point of view and from the analysts that we consulted, we saw that these are potential indicators of at least a semi-coordinated harassment campaign. So we responded by releasing a carousel that broke down a bit of the data around this initial attack. And since then, the embassy has released at least around 3 more rebuttals of the PCIJ, insinuations that we are US propaganda and the like. But thankfully, there have been a lot of other organizations that have come to the PCIJ's defense, including the Committee to Protect Journalists and a bunch of other local media coalitions and organizations, such as the National Union for Journalists, the Foreign Correspondents Association. I think this response is quite different from other contexts in Southeast Asia because the Philippines is very protective of its free press, I would say. And they understand that we are one of the few places in Southeast Asia that can criticize China as openly as we can, and we want to protect that freedom, at least in the media industry. And that's why the response has been so much support.
But I'm curious about you as a journalist. When you're being attacked by a foreign entity, how does that impact you and how does it affect your reporting?
It has been scary, I will admit. I think that there is maybe a bit of enlightenment in the idea that the embassy did not name me outright. However, they did post my name and face because of the screen cap that they lifted from Jay Tariela's page. Mostly, they've been attacking PCIJ as a newsroom. So I'm not sure what that means for me as an individual. However, I'd like to say that I personally have nothing against China. I'm still very happy to continue to report about China, even though it is admittedly a little scary to know that you are on the radar in this way. But I think that if you close read the article, there has been nuance in it, in that we've been careful to distinguish between what we can say are actual China state-linked operations and what are influence operations that are linked more closely to these bloggers. So the wording that we used in our story, for example, was pro-China influence. We didn't say Chinese state influence because we don't know at some points where the intervention of the state begins and at what point interference or influence can become organic.
Now, Summer, we've seen China go after politicians and spokespeople. Is it common for them to go after journalists like this?
We are safe in Taiwan. However, as a Taiwanese fact checkers, because I always debunking the propaganda from China and the very malicious disinformation, it may be originated from China. We can see the threats, so I want to travel to China, even transferred in Hong Kong.
Even as a fact checker, you're worried about these threats, and
Right.
it has changed kind of your own travel plans or your willingness to go to China. Regine, you mentioned the connection between Chinese influence operations in the Philippines and supporters of former Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte. Your organization, other organizations have looked into this. What have you found?
So a number of them have actually been found and have admitted to attending content training in Beijing. I'd like to say, though, and this is something that we were very careful to mention in our article, that this by itself is not necessarily an indicator that you are co-opted or that you are a tool of the Chinese state. A more accurate indicator as to whether you produce content that's favorable of the Chinese state is to really look at narrative analysis and at the things that these influencers say once they get back to the Philippines. And for the influencers that we've monitored, and in fact, they even play a complementary role in that it was these influencers that effectively worked as attack dogs for China critics. They were constantly parroting Beijing rhetoric, pro-Beijing arguments. That might not necessarily be bad in and of itself. I mean, there is free speech in the Philippines. However, the methodology of these influencers would very often be to bully, to gaslight, to shame, basically to use kind of mercenary disinformation tactics against people who, one, were at the forefront of the transparency initiative in the Philippines with regards to China's maritime harassment in South China Sea, and two, people who just genuinely have legitimate questions about China, even if they completely deny that they would, say, for example, explicitly be on China's payroll. That setup might not matter because effectively they are arguing for China if you close read their content.
Summer, do we see influencers in Taiwan also pushing a pro-China narrative?
We think we need to be very careful because we are a democracy society, so people can have their freedom of speech, they can have their political attitude and their opinions. So that's why we say the influence is so hard to tell them if they are pro-China or if they have the other context that we don't know. I think in Taiwan, there are two kinds. We can say there are two kinds of influence we need to watch out. And one kind is they are political figures, and they have the connection and they have the contract with China's media. So their shorts or their talk show, they were spreading by China's media and especially Fujian media. And the other kind is they are like celebrities and they are pretty famous and they have the social impact in Taiwan, and they are invited and treated to China and saying China is great. And also there are a lot of young people, they are from Taiwan, they stay in China, and they are making a lot of shorts. So in very crucial moment, like whenever Taiwan have military drills, and we can see lots of shorts, they are indicate those young generation, young influence saying, oh, I think PLA is great, they need come to Taiwan, I will be very welcome them. So those kind of shorts happened in a very crucial moment. That will be very suspicious for me.
Now, Regine, you've called this the weaponization of influencer diplomacy. Can you tell us very briefly what does that mean and what kinds of narratives they're pushing in the Philippines?
So influencer diplomacy, usually it's a toolkit of diplomats, right? So China and other countries have very often deployed influencers to act as cultural ambassadors for tourism, for the Olympics. It's a fair tool for soft power. But what we're seeing in this particular case is that influencers are being recruited for political commentating, or at least China benefits from their political commentary, whether or not they're actively recruited. However, there's this move from soft power to their use for sharper power, and their content effectively serves the purpose of China's interests. The alumni of these Beijing-sponsored content training programs, we don't know what goes on when they go into these trainings. It's effectively a black box. Very often, I mentioned one argument that comes out of them where they basically deny China's expansionist ambition. There is also very prevalent anti-US rhetoric that comes out of that as well. Painting the Philippines as a tool or as a puppet of the US is a very common narrative. However, it's different from organic criticism of the US. For example, leftist activists being able to criticize both the US and China. But pro-Duterte influencers, for example, will always criticize the US, but never level the same criticism against China. And then you have smear against people who are at the forefront of the transparency campaign. Another common narrative that's come up is a kind of economic narrative where the Philippines and Filipinos need China and need China products. If you are not for China, or if you're willing to pick a fight with them, so to speak, in the West Philippine Sea, then you shouldn't be buying China products at all. And one other narrative that's quite prevalent as well is the kind of doomerism or doomsday rhetoric where they believe that, oh, you're poking the dragon pretty much. If you stand up to China, you are effectively inviting war by being pro the transparency initiative in South China Sea, which is quite an oversimplification, I would say, and analysts would say, of the Philippine diplomatic and security approach to South China Sea.
We've been speaking with journalist Regine Cabato in Manila and Summer Chen, founder of Taiwan-based FactLink. You can find our full conversation on how China's playbook is targeting Taiwan and Japan on Correspondents playlist on our website and YouTube. Thanks for watching.